Welcome to Apex Storyteller, where calming tales lead you to a peaceful night's sleep. Before we begin, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe. It supports me in creating more relaxing stories for you and others. Drop a comment below and share where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now, settle into your comfortable space, close your eyes, and let's start this soothing experience together. The Midnight Train to Ravenswood. The story revolves around a protagonist, Daniel Carter, a down-to-earth young man in his late 20s, who finds himself aboard a mysterious train after an accident. The train's passengers are peculiar, the destinations even more so, and every stop holds a haunting truth about his life. The story builds tension with open loops and delayed reveals, ensuring the audience remains hooked. The chapters unravel Daniel's connection to the train, the secrets of the passengers, and a horrifying realization about his fate. It was a night like any other, or so it seemed. Daniel Carter had no idea that by the time the clock struck midnight, his life would be anything but ordinary. But let me ask you this. If you woke up somewhere you couldn't explain, surrounded by faces that shouldn't exist, what would you do? The sound of metal screeching against metal jolted Daniel awake. The sharp scent of burning brakes mixed with the stale air of an old train car. He blinked rapidly, trying to piece together how he'd ended up here. The last thing he remembered was swerving his car to avoid a shadowy figure on a deserted road. Then darkness. His first instinct was to reach for his phone, but his pocket was empty. Frustrated, he glanced around. The train car was dimly lit by flickering yellow bulbs, casting eerie shadows on the cracked leather seats. The windows were fogged up, making it impossible to see outside. He wasn't alone. Across the aisle, an elderly woman in a faded floral dress hummed a tune that sent chills down his spine. Her hands trembled as she clutched a black and white photograph to her chest. A little further down, a man in a suit, so immaculate it seemed out of place, sat motionless, staring straight ahead. His eyes didn't blink. "Excuse me," Daniel said, his voice hoarse. "Where are we? What's going on?" The elderly woman turned her head slowly, her milky white eyes locking onto his. "You'll see soon enough," she whispered, her voice a raspy echo that didn't seem to come from her mouth. Daniel's pulse quickened. He stood, steadying himself against the sway of the train. The air felt thick, almost suffocating. He made his way to the nearest door, only to find it locked. He yanked at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Looking for a way out? The voice came from behind him. He spun around to see a young woman, maybe in her early 20s, with strikingly sharp features and dark eyes. She wore a vintage dress, the kind you'd expect to see in a black and white movie. "Yeah," Daniel said, his breath uneven. "Do you know how to open this?" She tilted her head, a faint smile playing on her lips. "You can't leave until it's your stop." "What stop?" Daniel demanded. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned and walked away, her footsteps silent against the metal floor. Building curiosity. Daniel's mind raced. This had to be a dream, a vivid, unsettling dream. He pinched his arm hard, but the pain was real. Too real. The train lurched suddenly, throwing him off balance. A low, mechanical groan echoed through the car as the train began to slow. Outside, shapes began to form in the fogged windows, dark, towering silhouettes of trees. The train screeched to a halt. A hiss of steam escaped as the door at the end of the car creaked open. Daniel hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to stay put. But the other passengers began to move. The elderly woman shuffled toward the door, still clutching her photograph. The man in the suit followed, his movements unnervingly rigid. "Wait," Daniel called out. "Where are you going?" Neither of them answered. Curiosity, and a gnawing sense of dread, propelled Daniel forward. He followed them into the next car, where the atmosphere was even stranger. The walls were lined with what looked like old family portraits, their eyes following him as he walked past. The floor was covered in a thin layer of mist that swirled around his feet. The passengers exited through another door at the far end of the car, stepping out onto what appeared to be a platform. Daniel hesitated again but knew he couldn't stay behind. The first stop reveal. The platform was unlike anything he'd ever seen. It wasn't a station but a clearing in the middle of a dense forest. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an unnatural light on the scene. The elderly woman walked toward a small cabin that looked as though it had been abandoned for decades. She opened the door, and Daniel caught a glimpse of what was inside. An old rocking chair, still moving as if someone had just been sitting in it. The man in the suit stood at the edge of the clearing, staring into the woods. He didn't move, didn't speak. "Hey?" Daniel called out, his voice shaking. "Can someone tell me what's going on?" The young woman appeared beside him again, as if out of nowhere. "This is her stop," she said, nodding toward the elderly woman. "What does that mean?" The young woman's eyes softened. "She's going home." Before Daniel could ask another question, the cabin door slammed shut. A piercing scream tore through the air, followed by silence. The cabin was gone. In its place was a single gravestone, the name too worn to read. Daniel's stomach churned. What just happened?" The young woman placed a hand on his shoulder. "You'll understand soon enough." Closing the chapter with a hook. The train's whistle blew, a haunting sound that sent shivers down Daniel's spine. The passengers began to board again, their faces blank and emotionless. Daniel stood frozen, his eyes locked on the gravestone. He wanted to run, to escape, but something told him there was no getting off this train. Not yet. As the train began to move again, the young woman leaned in close, her voice barely above a whisper. "Next stop is yours. Have you ever had the feeling that someone, or something, is watching you even when you're alone?" Daniel couldn't shake that feeling as the train rumbled through the darkness. But here's the thing. What if that watcher wasn't just a feeling but real? And worse, what if they were waiting for you at the next stop? The train groaned as it picked up speed, the sound reverberating through the empty corridors. Daniel sat by a fogged window, trying to calm the storm of questions in his mind. His reflection stared back at him, pale and wide-eyed, but it wasn't his reflection that unnerved him. It was the faint silhouette behind it. He spun around, but the aisle was empty. Just shadows, he told himself, but even his own thoughts sounded unconvincing. The young woman from before appeared again, as if summoned by his unease. She slid into the seat across from him, her expression unreadable. "You said the next stop is mine," Daniel began, his voice laced with frustration. "What does that mean?" She folded her hands neatly on the table, her dark eyes locking onto his. "It means you'll face what you've been running from." "What are you talking about?" "I'm not running from anything." Her lips curled into a faint smile. "Aren't you?" Building curiosity. Before he could press her further, the train lurched violently. The lights flickered, plunging the car into brief moments of darkness. When they stabilized, the young woman was gone. Daniel gritted his teeth, his fists clenching at his sides. This was madness, but whatever game this train was playing, he had to see it through. The train slowed again, and Daniel braced himself. Outside the window, a small, decrepit town came into view. The sign at the station was barely legible, its letters chipped and faded. "Eerie." The doors creaked open, and a cold wind rushed in, carrying with it the faint smell of damp earth and decay. Daniel hesitated, but the same inexplicable force that had compelled him earlier pushed him forward. The platform was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt alive, pressing down on him like a heavy weight. The town itself was shrouded in mist, its streets lined with crumbling buildings and flickering gas lamps. "Welcome back, Daniel." The voice stopped him in his tracks. It was deep, gravelly, and disturbingly familiar. He turned slowly to see a man standing a few feet away, dressed in a tattered sheriff's uniform. His face was obscured by shadows, but his posture was rigid, almost unnatural. "I don't know you," Daniel said, his voice trembling. The sheriff chuckled, a sound that sent chills racing down Daniel's spine. "Oh, you know me all right. We've met before, here." The unsettling encounter. The sheriff stepped into the light, revealing hollow eyes and a face marred with deep scars. "You left something behind, Daniel. Something you need to finish?" Daniel shook his head, backing away. "I don't know what you're talking about." The sheriff tilted his head as if studying him. "You will?" He pointed toward the center of the town, where a large, decrepit mansion loomed. Its windows were dark, and its doors hung slightly ajar, inviting and menacing all at once. Daniel's heart pounded. He didn't want to go, but his feet seemed to move on their own. The streets felt alive with whispers, voices he couldn't understand but felt in his bones. The mansion's door groaned as he pushed it open, revealing a grand foyer covered in a thick layer of dust. A chandelier hung precariously from the ceiling, its crystals clinking softly as if disturbed by an unseen hand. On the floor lay a photograph, yellowed with age. Daniel bent down to pick it up, and his breath caught in his throat. It was a picture of him, standing with a woman and a little girl, neither of whom he recognized. "Do you remember now?" The sheriff's voice echoed through the hall. Daniel spun around, clutching the photograph. "Who are they? What is this place?" The sheriff stepped closer, his eyes burning with intensity. "This is where it started, Daniel. Where you made your choice. The mansion's secrets." Suddenly, the floor beneath Daniel's feet shifted, and he stumbled backward. The mansion seemed to come alive, its walls pulsating like a heartbeat. Shadows moved along the edges of his vision, darting just out of reach. "Leave!" A voice screamed, high-pitched and filled with anguish. It came from everywhere and nowhere. Daniel's hands trembled as he clutched the photograph. "I don't understand," he shouted into the void. The shadows began to take shape, forming figures that surrounded him. Their faces were twisted, unrecognizable, but their eyes were filled with pain. "You left us," one of them whispered, their voice like the rustling of dead leaves. "No," Daniel murmured, shaking his head. I don't even know you." "You will," the sheriff said again, his voice calm amidst the chaos. "It's all coming back piece by piece. And when you remember, you'll have to decide. Will you finish what you started, or will you run again?" Closing the chapter with a hook. The shadows closed in, their icy touch sending shocks through Daniel's body. He screamed, clutching the photograph tighter, and suddenly, everything went dark. When he opened his eyes, he was back on the train, the photograph still in his hand. But now, the faces in the picture were clearer. The train's whistle blew, and the young woman appeared once more. She sat across from him, her expression softer this time. "It's not over yet," she said quietly. "What's not over?" Daniel demanded. She leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "The next stop will show you what you've been hiding from yourself." The train began to slow again, and Daniel's heart sank. What could possibly be worse than Elmstead? The train screeched to a halt, and the hiss of the doors opening cut through the suffocating silence. Outside, a heavy mist shrouded everything, swirling like a living entity. Daniel hesitated, gripping the armrest of his seat, his pulse pounding in his ears. The young woman across from him finally spoke, her voice low and steady. "You have to go." "Go where?" Daniel asked, his voice sharper than he intended. "There's nothing out there." "There's more than you think," she replied, standing and smoothing her coat. "And it's waiting for you?" He wanted to argue, to demand answers, but something in her calm demeanor unnerved him. With a reluctant breath, he stepped onto the platform, the mist immediately engulfing him. The train's doors shut behind him, and he turned just in time to see the young woman watching him through the glass. The train pulled away, its headlights fading into the fog, leaving Daniel alone. The platform beneath him creaked, old wood that felt brittle and weak. He squinted into the mist, trying to make sense of his surroundings, but the more he looked, the less he understood. Shapes flickered in and out of view, vague and insubstantial, as though the mist itself were toying with him. A faint sound broke the quiet, a melodic hum drifting through the air. It wasn't comforting, it was haunting, like a lullaby sung by someone who had long forgotten its meaning. Daniel stepped off the platform and onto a cobblestone path that stretched into the fog. Each step echoed unnaturally loud, as if the mist amplified the sound to remind him he was utterly alone. He hadn't gone far when the humming grew louder. It was coming from a large, ornate mirror that seemed to emerge from the mist like a ghostly apparition. The mirror stood impossibly tall, framed with intricate carvings of faces twisted in anguish. Daniel hesitated. His reflection stared back at him, but something was wrong. His face looked tired, gaunt, as though the weight of years he hadn't lived had suddenly been placed upon him. "Daniel," a voice whispered from the mirror. He froze. The voice wasn't his, but it was familiar. The reflection moved, but Daniel hadn't. It smiled, a cold, malicious grin that didn't belong to him. "You've been running for so long," it said, tilting its head. "Aren't you tired?" What are you?" Daniel stammered, stepping back. "I'm you," the reflection replied, its grin widening. "The real you. The one you've buried." Daniel shook his head, his breath quickening. "This is insane. I don't know what you're talking about." The reflection chuckled, a sound that sent chills racing down Daniel's spine. "You can't run from yourself forever. You've tried, haven't you? Hopping from place to place, hoping the past won't catch up. The mist around him thickened and shapes began to form within it. People, no shadows of people, surrounded him, their faces obscured but their presence suffocating. "You left us," one of the figures whispered. Daniel spun around, heart hammering. "I don't know you." "You do," another figure hissed. "You just don't want to remember." The mirror's surface rippled like water, and the scene within it changed. Daniel saw himself standing in a house, a warm, inviting home with a woman and a little girl. They were laughing, the kind of laughter that came from pure happiness. But then the scene shifted. The warmth faded, replaced by cold, stark emptiness. The house was abandoned, its walls cracked and its windows shattered. The woman and the girl were gone. "What is this?" Daniel demanded, his voice cracking. "It's what you left behind," the reflection said. "The life you abandoned. The people you failed." "No," Daniel whispered, clutching his head. I didn't leave them." "You did," the reflection snapped, its tone sharp and accusatory. "And now it's time to face what you've done." The mist closed in, the shadows pressing against him. He felt their cold hands, their accusing stares, their anguish. "Why did you leave us?" one shadow cried, its voice breaking with pain. Daniel sank to his knees, overwhelmed by the weight of their words. "I didn't mean to," he whispered. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." The mirror's surface rippled again, and this time it showed a different image. A graveyard shrouded in the same thick mist, with a single grave illuminated. "You can't hide forever," the reflection said. "The truth is waiting for you there." Daniel looked up, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. "What truth?" "You already know," the reflection replied, its grin fading into something far more sinister. "But you'll have to face it to remember." The mist began to pull him toward the graveyard, the cobblestones shifting beneath his feet. The shadows followed, their whispers growing louder, a cacophony of sorrow and anger. Daniel clenched his fists, forcing himself to move forward. The closer he got to the graveyard, the heavier the air felt, as though the mist itself were trying to hold him back. When he reached the illuminated grave, he froze. His name was etched into the headstone, the dates below it matching the years he couldn't remember. "No," he murmured, shaking his head. "This isn't real." The reflection appeared beside him, stepping out of the mirror as though it had always been there. "It's as real as you make it," it said. "Now tell me, Daniel, are you ready to remember the rest?" The shadows surged forward, and the mist swallowed him whole. The air grew colder, heavier, as the mist around Daniel thickened. His breath came in short, panicked bursts as he stared at the gravestone with his name engraved on it. The dates mocked him, filling the gaps in his memory with a truth he wasn't ready to confront. Behind him, the reflection stood silently, a shadowy version of himself, its presence as oppressive as the mist. "This can't be real," Daniel whispered, his voice trembling. "I'm alive. I'm standing right here." The reflection smirked, tilting its head in mock sympathy. "Are you though? Or have you just been pretending all along?" Before Daniel could respond, a chilling voice whispered through the air, low and raspy. "He's here." Daniel whipped around, but no one was there. The voice came again, this time from the direction of the gravestone. "Do you remember us, Daniel?" A figure began to take shape near the grave. It was a woman, her face pale and ethereal, her eyes hollow but filled with sorrow. She reached out to him, her movements slow and deliberate. "Who are you?" Daniel asked, his voice cracking. The woman didn't answer directly. Instead, she took another step forward, and a little girl appeared beside her, clutching her hand. The girl's face was obscured by shadows, but her small frame trembled as if she were crying. Daniel staggered back, his heart pounding. No, this isn't happening." The reflection leaned in close, whispering in his ear. "You know who they are. You've always known." Memories began to flicker in Daniel's mind, like old photographs coming into focus. A house filled with laughter, a warm embrace, the sound of a child's giggle. Then the darker moments, a slammed door, angry voices, and the final haunting silence. "You left us," the woman said, her voice filled with both pain and accusation. "You promised to protect us, but you ran away." "I didn't mean to," Daniel stammered, his knees buckling. "I didn't know what to do. I was scared." "Scared?" The woman's tone turned sharp, her sorrow giving way to anger. "Do you think we weren't? Do you think we had a choice?" The little girl stepped forward, her small hand reaching for Daniel. When her face came into view, it was pale and lifeless, her eyes dull and unseeing. "Why didn't you come back for me, Daddy?" she asked softly. The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. I tried," he said, tears streaming down his face. I thought I could fix things." The shadows around the graveyard began to close in, forming a circle around Daniel. Each one whispered his name, their voices a mix of sorrow and fury. "You can't run anymore," one shadow said. "You have to face what you did," another hissed. Daniel clutched his head, overwhelmed by the cacophony. "Stop," he shouted. "Just stop." But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, their accusations cutting deeper. The reflection crouched beside him, its grin gone, replaced by a look of cold detachment. "This is what happens when you bury the truth," it said. "It doesn't go away. It festers. And eventually it comes for you." The woman knelt beside Daniel, her ethereal hand resting on his shoulder. Despite her earlier anger, there was a flicker of compassion in her gaze. "You still have a chance," she said softly. "A chance for what?" Daniel asked, his voice raw. "To make it right," she replied. The ground beneath them shifted, and the gravestone began to sink into the earth, revealing a staircase that spiraled downward into darkness. "You have to go down," the woman said. "What's down there?" Daniel asked, his throat dry. "The truth," she replied simply. Daniel hesitated, but the pull of the staircase was too strong to resist. As he descended, the air grew colder, and the whispers of the shadows faded into a heavy, oppressive silence. The stairs ended in a cavernous room lit by a faint, otherworldly glow. In the center of the room stood a table, and on it lay a large book bound in cracked leather. The book seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy as though it were alive. Daniel approached cautiously, his footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. The title on the book's cover was written in a language he couldn't understand, but he instinctively knew it was connected to him. "Open it," the woman's voice urged from behind him, though she was nowhere to be seen. With trembling hands, Daniel lifted the cover. The pages were blank at first, but then words began to appear, written in a dark, flowing script. The first page told a story he recognized. It was his own life, from his childhood to the moment he boarded the train. Each page that followed revealed a memory he had tried to forget. The argument with his wife, the night he stormed out, the accident that claimed their lives while he was miles away. "No," Daniel whispered, slamming the book shut. "This isn't right. This isn't how it happened." "But it is," the reflection said, appearing across the table. "And you've been running from it ever since." Daniel's knees gave out and he sank to the floor. The weight of his guilt was suffocating. "What do I do now?" he asked, his voice barely audible. The reflection leaned closer, its expression unreadable. "You have to choose," it said. "Carry the weight of your sins forever, or let it consume you." The room began to tremble, the walls cracking and the light dimming. The book glowed brighter, its energy pulsating. Daniel reached for it, his hand steady despite his fear. As his fingers touched the cover, a searing pain shot through him, and the world around him dissolved into darkness. When Daniel opened his eyes, he was no longer in the cavern. Instead, he found himself standing in the middle of a small, familiar town. The streets were eerily silent, and a soft, golden light bathed the empty storefronts and houses. It was his hometown, just as he remembered it from his childhood, but something was wrong. The air carried a strange stillness, and there was no sound of birds, wind, or distant chatter. It felt like the world had been paused, frozen in time. "Hello?" Daniel called out, his voice echoing unnaturally. He wandered down the street, passing houses he used to know. There was the old bakery where his mother bought bread every Sunday, the park where he played as a child, and even the library where he first discovered his love of books. But each building seemed lifeless, their windows dark and their doors closed. As he approached the town square, a figure appeared in the distance. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, standing with his back to Daniel. "Excuse me," Daniel shouted, quickening his pace. The man didn't turn. When Daniel reached him, he stopped short. The man wasn't a stranger. It was his father, dressed in the same worn flannel shirt and jeans he always wore when working in the yard. "Dad?" Daniel whispered, his voice shaking. His father turned slowly, his face ashen and his eyes hollow. He stared at Daniel for a long moment before speaking. "You shouldn't be here." What do you mean? Daniel asked. I don't even know where here is. His father's expression was grim. This place isn't for the living. And you've been treading too close to it for too long? Daniel's stomach tightened. I don't understand. Am I dead? His father shook his head. Not yet. But you're walking a thin line, son. Before Daniel could respond, the light in the town square dimmed, and shadows began to creep across the ground, stretching toward him like grasping hands. What is that? Daniel asked, panic rising in his chest. The past, his father replied. And it's coming for you? The shadows began to take shape, forming figures that were both familiar and alien. Among them was the woman from the graveyard, her face twisted in anguish, and the little girl, her empty eyes fixed on Daniel. You have to face them, his father said, stepping back. I can't help you anymore. The shadows surged forward, encircling Daniel. He stumbled back, his breath quick and shallow. Why did you leave us? The woman demanded, her voice sharp and piercing. I didn't mean to, Daniel shouted. I was scared. I didn't know what to do. The little girl stepped closer, her voice soft and heart-wrenching. You promised you'd always be there, Daddy. You said you'd protect me. Daniel fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm so sorry. The figures didn't relent. They closed in, their presence suffocating. You can't run from this, his father's voice echoed, though he was no longer visible. The only way out is through. The word struck something deep within Daniel. He took a shaky breath and forced himself to stand. I'm here, he said, his voice trembling but steady. I'll face whatever I have to. Just tell me what to do. The figures stopped, their accusing stares softening. The woman's expression shifted from anger to sorrow, and the little girl's eyes filled with something that looked like hope. You have to remember, the woman said. Remember what? Daniel asked. Everything, she replied. The shadows dissolved and the world around Daniel shifted. He was no longer in the town square but in a small, cozy living room. It was his childhood home, exactly as he remembered it. On the couch sat his younger self, no older than 10, clutching a photo album. Across from him, his parents argued in hushed tones, their faces tense. You can't shield him from everything, his father said. He needs to know the truth. He's just a child, his mother replied, her voice breaking. How do you tell a child that his brother isn't coming back? Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He had a brother, a fact he had somehow forgotten. The memory shifted, and Daniel saw himself as a teenager, sitting alone in his room. His parents were gone, and the house was quiet, too quiet. The loneliness was palpable, a weight that had stayed with him into adulthood. Another shift, and Daniel saw himself as an adult, arguing with his wife. The pain in her eyes mirrored the sorrow he had seen in his mother's years ago. You're shutting me out, she shouted. I'm trying to help you, but you won't let me in. I'm fine, Daniel yelled back. I don't need anyone's help. The memory blurred, replaced by the final image. Daniel standing outside his home, watching as his wife and daughter drove away. The car disappeared down the street, and Daniel stood there, his fists clenched, his pride too stubborn to call them back. The vision faded, and Daniel found himself back in the lifeless town, his father standing before him once more. It's all connected, his father said. Every choice, every moment. It's what brought you here. Daniel nodded, his throat tight. I see that now. But how do I fix it? You can't change the past, his father replied. But you can stop running from it. Face it, learn from it, and let it go. The shadows receded, the light returning to the town. The figures faded, their voices quieting until there was only silence. Daniel took a deep breath, the weight on his chest lifting slightly. He wasn't free yet, but he was ready to keep going. Daniel emerged from the shadows, each step feeling heavier than the last. His father's voice echoed in his mind, haunting yet comforting, like a distant song he couldn't quite remember. The town that had seemed eerily still was now shifting, warping. Streets bent into impossible angles, and the horizon twisted, leaving him with no clear direction. The air carried an oppressive weight, as though the world itself was watching him. For a moment, Daniel thought he could hear whispers, faint and indistinct, like a chorus of ghosts recounting their stories. Who's there? He called out, his voice quivering. The whispers grew louder, merging into a single chilling sentence. Do you think you've earned forgiveness? Daniel froze. He turned in a circle, his eyes darting to every corner of the distorted town. Shadows slithered along the edges of the buildings, curling and stretching toward him. "I don't know," he admitted aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm trying." The shadows recoiled as though his words had burned them. Then, without warning, they surged forward, enveloping him completely. When the darkness receded, Daniel found himself in a new place, a desolate wasteland. The ground was cracked and dry, and the air was thick with ash. The sky above was a deep, unnatural red, and a massive, ominous structure loomed in the distance. It looked like a fortress, its jagged spires reaching toward the sky like claws. Daniel's chest tightened. He knew instinctively that this place was significant. Whatever lay inside that fortress was the source of everything: the whispers, the shadows, the haunting visions. If he wanted answers, he would have to go in. As he approached, the ground beneath his feet shifted, almost as if it were alive. He could feel it pulsing, vibrating with a sinister energy. With every step, memories flooded his mind, memories he had long buried. He saw his brother again, the one he had forgotten. They were playing in the backyard, laughing as they chased each other. Then came the accident, the day his brother fell from the tree. Daniel had been too scared to move, too paralyzed by fear to call for help. The memory shifted, and he saw his wife and daughter once more, their faces etched with disappointment and sorrow. He had pushed them away, hiding his pain instead of sharing it, and in doing so he had lost them. As the memories overwhelmed him, Daniel reached the gates of the fortress. They were enormous, made of blackened iron, with intricate carvings depicting scenes of suffering and despair. A voice spoke from within. It was deep and resonant, shaking Daniel to his core. "You carry your sins like chains, mortal. Do you wish to be free of them?" Daniel hesitated. "Yes," he said finally, "but I don't know how." The gates creaked open, revealing a long, dark corridor. Torches lined the walls, their flames casting flickering shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. As Daniel stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind him, leaving him in near total darkness. The only light came from the torches, which burned with an unnatural blue flame. The corridor seemed endless, stretching on forever. But as Daniel walked, he began to notice things, small objects scattered along the floor. He picked up a toy car, its paint chipped and faded. It was his brother's favorite toy. Further along, he found a torn piece of paper with a drawing of a house. He recognized it immediately. His daughter had drawn it for him, hoping to cheer him up on a particularly bad day. Each object was a reminder of a moment he had tried to forget. They were pieces of his life, fragments of his pain and regret. Finally, the corridor ended, opening into a vast chamber. At the center stood a massive, swirling vortex of darkness. It pulsed with an otherworldly energy, and Daniel could feel its pull like gravity. "You seek forgiveness," the voice boomed again. "But forgiveness must be earned. Step into the abyss and face the truth." Daniel's heart pounded. The vortex was terrifying, but he knew he had no choice. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward and plunged into the darkness. The abyss was a chaotic swirl of images and sounds. Daniel saw his entire life flash before him, not just the bad moments but the good ones too. He saw his brother's smile, his wife's laughter, and his daughter's hugs. But then the darkness spoke again, this time in a whisper. "You can't change the past, but what will you do with the future?" The images faded, and Daniel found himself standing in a room. It was his old house, but everything was gray and lifeless. In the corner he saw himself, a younger version, sitting alone and crying. "Talk to him," the voice urged. Daniel hesitated, then approached his younger self. "It's okay," he said softly. "You're not alone. You don't have to carry this by yourself." The younger Daniel looked up, his tear-streaked face filled with confusion. "But it's my fault," he said. "I ruined everything." "No," Daniel replied. "You made mistakes, but you're not defined by them. You can still make things right." As he spoke, the room began to change. Color returned to the walls and light streamed through the windows. The younger Daniel disappeared, and in his place stood his wife and daughter, smiling at him. The voice spoke one final time. "You faced your past. Now will you fight for your future?" Daniel nodded. He wasn't free yet, but he was ready to keep fighting. Daniel stood at the edge of the void, the echoes of his past swirling around him like a storm. He had confronted the shadows of his mistakes, the memories he had long buried. But as the abyss pulsed with an unrelenting darkness, he knew there was one final step to take. The voice that had guided him through the labyrinth of his memories spoke again, but this time, it was softer, almost human. "Do you understand now, Daniel? This place was never about punishment. It was about choice." Daniel clenched his fists. "I understand," he said, his voice firm. "I can't change what I've done, but I can decide what I'll do from here." The darkness receded slightly, revealing a path ahead. It was a bridge, fragile and narrow, suspended over a chasm of nothingness. At the far end, a faint light glimmered, warm, inviting, and alive. "This is your last test," the voice said. "The bridge leads to your redemption, but the path is fraught with the weight of your past. Each step will ask you to let go of something you've held onto. Only when you release it all will you reach the other side." Daniel took a deep breath and stepped onto the bridge. As his foot touched the bridge, the chasm below erupted in sound. Voices rose, accusing and sharp. "Why didn't you help me?" his brother's voice shouted. "You left us," his wife's voice cried. "You promised," his daughter's voice whispered. Daniel's chest tightened. The weight of their words was crushing, and for a moment he thought he might fall. But then he remembered what he had learned. "I hear you," he said aloud. "And I'm sorry. But guilt alone won't bring you back, and it won't fix what's broken. I can only move forward by trying to be better." The voices softened, and the bridge steadied beneath him. He took another step. A wave of heat washed over him as the next step brought memories of his rage. Fights with his wife, frustration at his daughter, and the seething anger he had directed inward. "You were weak," a voice snarled, deep and venomous. "You let your anger control you. It's who you are." "No," Daniel said, his voice trembling but resolute. "It's who I was. Anger is a choice, and I don't have to choose it anymore." The heat subsided, and the bridge extended further. The chasm below grew darker, and a bone-chilling cold seeped into his skin. Images of his failures played out before him. The tree his brother had fallen from, the packed bags his wife carried, the empty seat at the dinner table where his daughter should have been. "You'll fail again," the cold whispered. "Why try? You'll only make things worse." Daniel closed his eyes, steadying his breath. "Fear held me back before, but not anymore. If I fail, I'll keep trying. If I fall, I'll get back up. That's what matters." The cold dissipated, and the bridge became solid once more. As Daniel approached the light, the path seemed to stretch endlessly. A figure appeared ahead of him, shrouded in shadow. It was himself, older, bitter, and weighed down by years of regret. "You can't forgive yourself," the shadow said, its voice heavy with despair. "You don't deserve it." Daniel felt tears well in his eyes. The shadow was right. He had spent so long believing he wasn't worthy of forgiveness. But standing here, on this bridge between his past and his future, he realized the truth. "No one deserves forgiveness," he said, his voice breaking. "It's not something you earn. It's something you choose to give, to others and to yourself. And I choose to forgive." The shadow hesitated, then dissolved into the air. The light at the end of the bridge flared brighter, and Daniel stepped forward, his heart lighter than it had been in years. Daniel emerged from the abyss into a lush, sunlit meadow. The air was warm and filled with the scent of wildflowers. In the distance he saw two figures, a woman and a little girl, waving at him. Tears streamed down his face as he ran toward them. When he reached them, his wife embraced him tightly, and his daughter looked up at him with a smile. "You came back," his wife whispered. "I'll always come back," Daniel replied, his voice thick with emotion. As they stood together, the voice spoke one last time, now gentle and reassuring. "The past is behind you, Daniel. The future is yours to shape. Go live it well." Daniel had faced the shadows of his past and emerged stronger, more whole. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to walk it, with his family by his side. And as he walked away from the meadow, the abyss faded into nothingness, leaving only the warmth of the sun and the promise of a brighter tomorrow. It was supposed to be a typical evening, just like any other. But the air felt heavier tonight, like the weight of the world was bearing down on Sarah. She walked into the kitchen, reached for the glass on the counter, but something stopped her. Something wrong. A shadow darted across the window. Just a flicker, so quick that Sarah wondered if she had imagined it. Her heart raced, but she shrugged it off. It was just the wind, right? Maybe a bird? She went back to her evening routine, trying to calm the knot in her stomach, But there it was again, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. Her eyes darted to the corner of the kitchen, where the shadows were thicker, darker than usual. She shook her head. It was nothing. She was just tired, stressed from work. She had no reason to feel this way. But that was when it happened. The kitchen light flickered, then died completely. The silence that followed was suffocating. Her breath became shallow, her skin prickled with goosebumps. Something wasn't right. "Hello?" she called out, trying to steady her voice. But the only response was the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant murmur of the wind outside. She forced herself to move, stepping cautiously toward the darkened corner. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet, a sound that made her heart jump in her chest. She didn't want to look, but she had to. The feeling of someone, or something, lurking in the corner was too much to ignore. She reached for the switch, her fingers trembling. Click. Nothing. The power was out. Again. Her mind raced. She had just paid the bill. This couldn't be happening. Then she heard it, footsteps. Soft, deliberate, coming from behind her. She spun around so quickly her head spun. But there was nothing. No one. The room was empty. But the feeling remained. Someone, or something, was here. Her heart pounded in her ears as she backed into the wall, her breath coming in short gasps. The footsteps continued, each one closer than the last. But still there was no one to be seen. Was she going crazy? The shadows in the corner seemed to shift, and Sarah thought she saw something move, just the barest flicker of a figure. But then just as quickly it was gone. She wiped the sweat off her forehead and turned back to the window. A full moon now cast an eerie glow over the backyard. And that's when she saw it, the silhouette of someone standing just beyond the trees. A figure so still it almost looked like part of the shadows. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. No one should be out there. Not at this hour. With trembling hands she grabbed her phone. No signal. No service. The room felt smaller, suffocating. The walls were closing in. The sound of her own breathing was the only thing she could hear. And then it happened, a knock on the door. Her stomach flipped. She didn't want to answer it. Not like this. Not with the darkness in the corner and the figure outside the window. "Who is it?" she asked, her voice cracking. No response. Another knock. And another. Her hands shook uncontrollably as she reached for the doorknob. But she stopped. The figure was gone. No more knocks. No more footsteps. Everything fell silent again. But the feeling of being watched, the one that had been gnawing at her since she stepped into the kitchen, grew louder. Stronger. She wasn't alone. Then she heard it again, a whisper. It came from the corner. Soft, so soft she could barely hear it. But it was there. "Sarah?" Her body went cold. The whisper grew louder. "Sarah, I see you." She couldn't breathe. Her body locked in place. The door, the window, the corner. Everywhere was closing in. The whisper turned into a voice, a deep, raspy voice that filled her mind. "You can't run. You can't hide. I'm here. And I always will be." Suddenly, the lights flickered back on, blinding her. The room was normal again. The corner? Empty. The figure outside the window? Gone. The door? Locked. Sarah collapsed to her knees, gasping for air. Her hands shook as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. What was real? What was a nightmare? She glanced at the clock. It was almost 2 a.m. Her phone buzzed. A message from her best friend, Lisa. "Hey, everything okay? I just got a weird feeling and wanted to check on you." Her heart skipped a beat. A feeling? Like the one Sarah had? How could Lisa have known? Before she could type a reply, another message popped up. "I don't know how to say this, but I just saw someone in the window behind you." Sarah froze. Her phone slipped from her hand, hitting the floor with a dull thud. She was not alone. And something out there, something unseen, was waiting. Sarah barely slept that night. Every creak of the house, every whisper of wind against the window made her jump. She hadn't been able to shake the image of that dark figure lurking outside, nor the chilling words from the whisper in the corner. "I'm here and I always will be." The morning light broke through the blinds, bringing with it a sense of relief. At least it felt like the worst was over. But that feeling was fleeting. She forced herself out of bed, her body aching from the tension of the night. The house felt wrong. Even in the daylight, the shadows seemed longer, the air thicker. As she passed by the hallway mirror, she stopped. There was something about it, something different. The reflection in the mirror seemed off, like it didn't belong. She stood frozen, staring at her own face. Her eyes were wide, pupils dilated, her skin pale. But it was more than that. It was like the reflection was too still. She reached out to touch the surface of the glass, but as her fingers neared, the reflection of her hand moved slowly as though it was delayed. What? She pulled her hand back, feeling a knot form in her stomach. The reflection did the same, it pulled back too. She could see the subtle delay, the movement out of sync with her own actions. A wave of dread washed over her. There was something wrong with the mirror. Something unnatural. It's just your mind playing tricks on you, she tried to convince herself. The stress, the lack of sleep. But deep down she knew better. She couldn't tear herself away. Her reflection was still. Too still. And then, just as she was about to step back, a movement in the mirror caught her eye. A shadow. A dark figure, not hers, stood just behind her. Her breath caught in her throat. No way. She spun around, heart hammering in her chest, expecting to see something, someone, there, but the hallway was empty. The air felt stifling, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. She slowly turned back to the mirror, barely daring to look. But it was there again, the shadow. It was different this time. It was closer, almost as if it had stepped forward from the darkness. Sarah? The voice was barely a whisper, yet it filled the entire room like it was coming from every direction. Her name, spoken in a low, guttural voice that she knew, was not her own. She didn't scream. She couldn't. Her body was frozen, paralyzed with fear. The shadow in the mirror began to move. Slowly, it lifted its hand, a hand that was not hers. Sarah's reflection stood still, but the shadow in the mirror was stepping closer, inch by inch, until it was standing right behind her. The reflection smiled, a slow, wicked grin that wasn't her own. I told you, the voice echoed in her mind. In a panic, Sarah bolted away from the mirror, nearly tripping over herself as she scrambled down the hallway. Her mind was racing. What was happening? Who, or what, was in that mirror with her? But as she reached the door, something stopped her. It was the feeling again, the sensation of being watched. She turned around slowly, looking over her shoulder. The hallway behind her was dark, but as she glanced back at the mirror, it was empty again. Nothing. It's just the mirror, she told herself. Nothing more. But she couldn't shake the image of that grin. The way it seemed to linger in her mind, twisting her thoughts, pulling her deeper into fear. She forced herself to take a breath and walk to the kitchen. It was time for some coffee, she told herself. Something to shake off the dread that had settled in her chest. The kitchen was still quiet, the sunlight filtering in through the window. Nothing seemed out of place. The sound of the coffee machine whirring to life calmed her for a moment, but that calm was shattered the instant the reflection in the kitchen window caught her eye. She froze, coffee cup in hand, staring out the window at the backyard. The figure was back, but this time it wasn't just standing there. This time it was moving, pacing slowly along the edge of the yard, circling something. Something in the ground. She couldn't make out what it was, but it felt wrong. The figure was too still and yet too alive. There was something unnatural about its movement, too smooth, too deliberate. It didn't look like a person. It didn't look like anything human at all. Her throat tightened. Why can't I escape this? The thought rushed through her mind. She took a step back from the window, but the figure didn't stop. It never stopped. It was still there watching her, waiting. And then it turned, slowly, as if it had been expecting her to look. Its eyes, those eyes, dark, void-like and unblinking, locked with hers. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The world outside the window became blurry, distant, until all she could see were those eyes. They weren't just watching her. They were staring into her soul. They know me. The silence that followed was suffocating. The air itself felt thick, oppressive. Why can't I move? Before she could tear her gaze away, the figure stepped forward, closer, too close, and then it smiled. The grin that spread across its face wasn't human. It wasn't even animalistic. It was a smile that sent waves of ice-cold terror crawling down her spine. A smile that had no business being on a living creature's face. No. Her mind screamed at her to run, to do anything, but she was rooted in place, paralyzed by the impossibility of what she was seeing. The figure didn't move closer. Not yet. It stood there in the yard, smiling, waiting. But Sarah couldn't take her eyes off of it. And somehow, in some horrible way, she knew, the longer she stared at it, the closer it would get. It wasn't just outside her window anymore. It had invaded her thoughts. It was in her mind, and it wasn't going to let her go. A faint whisper carried on the wind, just loud enough for her to hear. "You can't run from me?" And then, without warning, the figure vanished. Her heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. She stumbled backward, tripping over the edge of the kitchen chair, but the room seemed to spin. She couldn't focus. She couldn't think. All she could feel was that chill, that dark presence, lingering in every corner of the house. The figure was gone, but it hadn't left. It never had. The following night, Sarah couldn't bring herself to sleep. The events of the previous day, the whispering voice, the reflection in the mirror, had left her restless and frazzled. The house felt foreign now. The comfort it once provided seemed like a distant memory, and every creak of the floorboards echoed through her like a warning. She sat in the living room, the dim light of the lamp casting long, jagged shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind howled against the windows, but inside, the air felt unnaturally still. Too still. Sarah's phone buzzed again, snapping her from her thoughts. It was Matt again. "Are you sure you're okay? I feel like something's wrong." Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, but the words wouldn't come. What could she say? She couldn't even understand what was happening to her. She'd always been a rational person. But now, everything felt as though it were slipping through her fingers, out of her control. Was it all in her head? She stared at the text, the blinking cursor mocking her as she tried to find the right words. Finally, she typed, "I'm fine. Just a little freaked out. I'll be okay." But even as she sent the message, she didn't believe it. Sarah's thoughts kept drifting back to the mirror. The way her reflection had moved differently. The way it seemed wrong. She couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a trick of the light. That something else, something darker, had taken root inside the house, feeding off her fear. A knock at the door broke the silence, jolting her out of her thoughts. Her heart skipped a beat. It was late, too late for anyone to be visiting. She slowly rose from the couch, her mind racing. Who could it be? She approached the door cautiously, peeking through the peephole. No one stood on the other side. Confused, she opened the door a crack. No one was there. But there, lying on the doorstep, was a small, neatly folded piece of paper. Her breath caught in her throat. She bent down and picked up the paper, unfolding it with trembling hands. The note was simple, 2 words written in neat, careful handwriting. "Look again." The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. Look again? What? She felt like she was losing her grip on reality. The note didn't make sense. It didn't fit. It was as if the house itself was speaking to her, teasing her, pulling her deeper into its web of fear. She shut the door with a snap, locking it behind her, and leaned against it, breathing heavily. She had to stay calm, stay rational. But how could she? When every instinct screamed at her that something was terribly wrong. The house felt suffocating, and the silence pressed against her like a weight. Sarah moved quickly through the living room, her footsteps echoing louder than they should have been. She went into the hallway, her eyes immediately darting to the mirror on the far wall. The mirror. She approached it slowly, almost as if it was pulling her toward it, and she couldn't help herself. The memory of what happened the day before flashed in her mind. The way her reflection had moved on its own. The voice that had called her name. It was all becoming too much to bear. With each step, the sense of dread grew heavier. She was almost there now, only a few feet away, and her breath began to shallow. Her heart pounded in her chest. She stopped just before the mirror, staring at her reflection. Everything appeared normal, just her tired eyes, her disheveled hair. But then, there it was. Her reflection was different. It was faint, almost unnoticeable at first, but Sarah saw it. Her reflection was grinning. Not a normal smile. It was twisted, like a predator's grin, stretching unnaturally wide across her face. Her own face, her own reflection, looked back at her, grinning as if it knew something she didn't. Her breath hitched and she stumbled back, her back pressing into the wall. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. But the reflection, her reflection, wasn't moving with her anymore. It stayed fixed, smiling that horrible, cold smile. What was happening? Suddenly, the reflection's eyes narrowed, and it tilted its head slightly as if studying her. The smile grew wider, and Sarah could see something else now, There was something behind her reflection, a shadow that shouldn't have been there. It moved, growing larger, darker, like it was reaching out from behind the glass. With a gasp, Sarah turned around, expecting to see something standing there in the room with her. But there was nothing, just the empty hallway. She turned back to the mirror, but the reflection had changed again. Now, it wasn't just grinning, it was mocking her, moving its lips in time with her own movements like it was mimicking her every action. But the movements were off. The lips moved, but the eyes didn't. The eyes were cold, lifeless, hollow, and they were no longer looking at her. They were staring somewhere behind her. Her body froze. Sarah slowly turned her head, and that's when she saw it. In the doorway, standing just inside the room, was a figure, tall, dark, and faceless. It was just a shadow, a silhouette that seemed to suck the very light out of the room. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The figure didn't move. It just stood there watching her. Her pulse raced, her heart hammering in her chest. This wasn't just a hallucination. She could feel it. Its presence was suffocating, cold and oppressive, like the air around her had thickened, pushing her down. She could feel its gaze on her, pressing against her skin like a vice. Her legs felt weak, her body trembling as she backed away, but the figure didn't follow. It just stood in place, its form beginning to distort, stretch, and warp. It wasn't a person. It was something else. Something that didn't belong. Sarah, the voice whispered again, the same cold, hollow tone that had haunted her before. She wanted to run, to escape, but her feet wouldn't move. It was as if the figure was rooting her to the spot, trapping her in its gaze. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, dissolving into the shadows of the room. Sarah blinked. Her head spun. She couldn't think straight. What was real? What wasn't? She turned back to the mirror. Her reflection was still there, grinning, but now it was different. Now it knew her. Her heart stopped as she watched the reflection slowly raise one finger to its lips and whisper, "Shoo." Sarah could still feel the presence, its cold fingers clinging to her skin like frostbite. Every breath she took felt heavier, weighed down by an unseen force pressing against her chest. The mirror, her reflection, still haunted her, its twisted grin burned into her mind. But it wasn't just the reflection anymore. The entire house had become an extension of that dark, suffocating energy. The shadows seemed to shift, to move in ways they shouldn't, whispering secrets she couldn't understand. She stumbled backward from the mirror, her hands reaching out to steady herself against the wall. Her heart raced. The figure, the faceless shadow, was gone, but its presence lingered, thickening the air. She couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone in the house anymore, that something was waiting for her. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily, a sound that once brought comfort now felt like a countdown to something inevitable, something terrifying. The silence in the house was oppressive. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside felt like a threat. She couldn't remember when the house had gotten so quiet, so still. It was as if it had taken on a life of its own. The walls seemed to close in on her, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood at attention. She glanced at the hallway, half expecting to see the dark figure again, its faceless silhouette looming in the doorway. But there was nothing, only the faint flicker of the light above. Sarah's phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her. She fumbled to pull it out, relief washing over her as she saw that it was a message from Matt. "Where are you? I'm really worried. Call me when you get this." Her fingers hovered over the screen, but she couldn't bring herself to respond. She couldn't tell him the truth. She couldn't explain the unexplainable. The terror that had taken root in the house was something he wouldn't understand. It wasn't something anyone could understand. Instead, she typed a simple reply, "I'm okay, just really tired. I'll talk to you tomorrow." But she knew it wasn't true. She wasn't okay. How could she be? The house felt like it was pressing in on her, as if the walls themselves were closing in, suffocating her. With a shaky breath, she forced herself to stand up straighter. She couldn't let fear take over. Not again. The shadows in the corner of the room seemed to twitch. Sarah's stomach dropped. She hadn't imagined that. She hadn't. The darkness in the corner had moved, shifted just slightly as though something was lurking there, waiting. She turned to face it, her eyes narrowing. Nothing. She tried to steady her breath, but the longer she stared, the more the shadows seemed to pulse, like the very air around her was vibrating. It was subtle but unmistakable. Something was wrong. The shadows weren't just shadows. They were alive. They were watching her. "Stop it," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. "It's just your mind playing tricks." But the moment she said it, she knew it wasn't true. No trick of the mind could explain the way the darkness was now moving. It didn't make sense. She had to be imagining it. She had to be. But deep down in the pit of her stomach, Sarah knew something worse was at play. Something real. Something that was watching, waiting, and growing. Her legs were shaking as she stepped closer to the corner, her eyes not leaving the growing darkness. It seemed to stretch further, like it was reaching toward her. Without thinking, she reached out, her fingers brushing the wall beside her. But the moment her hand made contact, the temperature of the room dropped. A bone-chilling cold surged from the wall, sending a jolt of ice through her veins. It was sudden, overwhelming, and unlike anything she had ever felt. It was as if the very wall had turned to ice, a cold that went straight to her bones. Her breath caught in her throat as the cold spread throughout the room, enveloping her. She felt like she was being pulled into the very darkness itself. The shadows seemed to grow larger, closer, and Sarah stumbled back, clutching her arms around her body for warmth. Her heart pounded in her chest, the fear building until she thought she might pass out from the pressure. She had to leave. She had to get out of there. But every step she took felt like she was sinking deeper into the cold, into the dark. She was trapped. The house had become a maze, each hallway, each corner, each room an endless cycle of fear. There was no escape. The house was the nightmare and she couldn't run from it. "Sarah?" The voice whispered again, only this time, it wasn't just in her head. It was real. It was here, inside the room with her, emanating from the shadows. It wasn't a voice she recognized, but it was familiar in a way that made her blood run cold. She couldn't understand the words, but she could feel the malice in them. The hatred. Who is that?" she gasped, her voice breaking. She didn't know who she was asking. There was no one else in the room. No one. But the voice answered anyway. "I'm here." It was low, guttural, like something from the very bowels of the earth. It felt like the walls were shaking, trembling under the weight of that voice, as though the house itself was alive. Alive in a way that was unnatural. Suddenly, the light above her flickered, casting the room into a strobe of darkness and light. Each flicker was like a pulse, like the house was breathing, inhaling and exhaling in slow, deliberate motions. The shadows seemed to stretch with each pulse, crawling along the walls, pulling closer, enveloping everything in their path. Sarah's eyes darted from corner to corner, panic rising in her chest. She was no longer alone in the room. The shadows had come to life, swirling around her, moving like a living, breathing thing. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The room seemed to close in on her, the walls growing tighter, the air growing heavier. The shadows surrounded her, and her reflection, her twisted, mocking reflection, stared back at her from the mirror. And then it smiled. That smile. The same cold, predatory grin she had seen before. But now it wasn't just the reflection smiling. The smile was real. It was right in front of her. Behind her. Everywhere. The shadows closed in. And Sarah knew without a doubt that she wasn't going to make it out alive. Sarah's eyes darted around the room, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The darkness had swallowed every corner, every inch of space, and now the house felt like a living organism, one that was watching, waiting, breathing with her. She tried to move, to escape, but her legs felt like lead. The floor beneath her feet seemed to ripple like water, distorting and shifting with every step. Her mind screamed for her to run, but she couldn't. There was no escape. She was trapped. The shadows, those twisted, suffocating shapes, seemed to mock her, growing larger with each breath she took. They pressed in around her, pulsating in rhythm with her heartbeat. She tried to scream, but her voice was drowned out by the low hum of the house, an unnatural sound that reverberated through her chest, filling her with an overwhelming sense of dread. "You can't get out." The thought wormed its way into her mind, cold and invasive. The more she tried to push it away, the stronger it became. The mirror, her reflection, still grinned at her, its eyes dark and hollow as if mocking her every move. It was a cruel reminder that no matter where she turned, the house was always watching. Always there. Sarah stumbled back, her hands flying out to catch herself against the wall. But the wall, it wasn't solid anymore. It was soft, like fabric, like the walls themselves had transformed into something malleable, something alive. Her heart hammered in her chest as her fingers sank into the surface, an icy cold creeping up her arm. The temperature had dropped again. The cold, biting air seemed to cut through her skin, her bones, her very soul. She pulled her hand away, but the cold remained, seeping through her body like a disease. There's nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The voice was back, low, guttural, echoing through the room as though it was coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Sarah's eyes darted around, searching for the source, but there was nothing. Just darkness. Just the shifting shadows that moved as though they had a will of their own. With trembling hands, she pulled her phone from her pocket once more, desperate to reach Matt. She needed to hear his voice, needed to be reminded that there was still something normal in the world, something that wasn't consumed by the madness of this house. The phone buzzed as she unlocked it, and she immediately tapped on his contact. Her fingers were slick with sweat, her vision blurred as she pressed the phone to her ear. The call rang through, and for a moment she thought maybe, just maybe, this would all end. He would answer. He would be there. But the call went to voicemail. A cold wave of panic swept over her. She tried again, her fingers shaking as she tapped the screen. Another ring. Another voicemail. "Matt, please pick up," she whispered, her voice cracking with desperation. The phone slipped from her fingers, falling to the floor with a soft thud. The screen cracked, splintering the display into jagged shards. She didn't care. She couldn't care. "Matt's not going to help you." The voice in her head was louder now, clearer. It was like it was inside her skull, whispering its cruel words directly into her mind. The shadows swirled, drawing closer as if in response to the thought. They seemed to press in on her, closer, tighter, until she could hardly breathe. The air was thick with an oppressive weight, and she was sure the walls were closing in around her, the space shrinking, suffocating her. Suddenly, the mirror caught her eye again. It had shifted, no longer just reflecting her image. It was moving. The figure in the glass wasn't her anymore. It was someone else. Someone tall and twisted, its face contorted into a grotesque mask of agony. The reflection reached out toward her, its hand coming out of the mirror, a cold, skeletal thing that seemed to scrape at the surface of the glass as if desperate to get through. Sarah recoiled, stumbling backward, her heart hammering in her chest. She hit the edge of a table, knocking a lamp to the ground, the glass shattering in a loud crash. But the sound didn't comfort her. It only seemed to fuel the shadows, drawing them in tighter. The house was alive. The house was feeding on her fear. She tried to stand, to escape, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. Her head was spinning and her vision blurred in and out. Everything around her seemed to pulse and shift, and she couldn't tell what was real anymore. Was the mirror moving? Was the floor rising up to swallow her whole? Or was it all in her mind? The whispering grew louder, louder than before, until it was deafening. "Come closer." The voice was seductive, coaxing, as if it was trying to lull her into some kind of trance. "Come closer, Sarah. You have nowhere else to go. We are here. We have always been here." Sarah clutched her ears, trying to block out the noise, but it was everywhere. The walls, the floors, the very air seemed to be speaking to her, urging her to give in, to surrender to whatever force had taken over this house. But she couldn't. She wouldn't. With one last surge of adrenaline, Sarah forced herself to her feet, her vision flickering. She had to leave. She had to get out of this place before it consumed her entirely. The front door. She just needed to make it to the front door. But when she reached the hallway, it wasn't there. The hallway stretched on endlessly, the door at the end nothing more than a distant, unreachable goal. The walls around her seemed to curve, bending and distorting in a way that made her stomach churn. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. Her eyes flickered to the floor beneath her. The rug was gone. In its place, the hardwood was warped, cracked, and pulsating like the veins of some terrible, monstrous creature. And then she saw it, the reflection. It wasn't in the mirror anymore. It was in the floor, in the walls, in the very shadows that seemed to creep and crawl like living things. It was coming for her. No matter where she went, no matter how hard she tried to escape, the house was always one step ahead. The shadows were closing in. The door was gone. The walls were closing in. And there was nowhere left to run. Sarah's pulse throbbed in her ears, drowning out everything else. She stumbled through the distorted hallway, desperately reaching out to the walls to steady herself. The air had grown thick, impossibly thick, and every breath felt like it was being torn from her lungs. The shadows, once vague and distant, now surrounded her, pressing in on every side. They had no shape, no form, but they felt alive, hungry, swirling in an unending, suffocating tide. She could hear them now, whispers, soft at first, but growing louder, more insistent, as though 1,000 voices were beckoning her toward the darkness. Sir, sir. The name echoed, each syllable dripping with malevolence, like 1,000 voices speaking from the walls. There was no escape. She pressed her hands against the walls, trembling. They were cold, slick with something that wasn't water. As she turned her back to them, she felt the floor shift beneath her feet. The once solid surface of the hardwood buckled and twisted, as if the house was pulling the very foundation out from under her. You can't leave. The whisper was clearer now, almost tangible, like it was breathing directly into her ear. Her breath came faster. Her fingers dug into the cold walls, the nails scraping against the smooth surface, trying to keep herself upright. But the house wasn't done with her. Wanted more. The whispers had turned to voices, clear and distinct, each one taking on a different tone. Some sounded familiar, like fragments of people she had known, but there was something wrong with them, twisted, distorted. Help me, Sarah. You can't escape, Sarah. You belong here now, Sarah. The floor gave a low groan beneath her as it cracked open, a jagged seam splitting down the center. She stumbled, falling to her knees, her hands desperately trying to steady herself against the floorboards. The shadows were growing now, pushing her toward the dark opening in the floor. It was wide now, stretching out like the maw of some hungry beast, waiting for her to fall into it. The air was colder than ever, like an icy hand wrapping around her chest, squeezing tighter with each breath. This is it. This is where it ends. The thought was a whisper in her mind, a crushing certainty that wrapped around her heart and squeezed. No matter how much she fought, no matter how much she wanted to escape, she could feel the house closing in on her. Her heart hammered painfully against her ribs, and she felt her eyes stinging with unshed tears. She had no idea how long she had been trapped in this nightmare. Hours? Days? She couldn't remember. Time felt distorted, a blurry haze that had no meaning anymore. All she knew was the suffocating darkness closing in around her. Please, she whispered, her voice barely a breath, but the house seemed to hear her. It pulsed in response. The shadows rippled as if to acknowledge her plea, but there was no mercy in their movement. The darkness was not her savior. It was her tormentor. There was no more escape, no more running. Suddenly she saw something, a figure barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, standing at the far end of the hallway just beyond the reach of the shadows. She squinted, trying to make sense of it. It looked like a person, but there was something wrong about them, something unnatural, like they were part of the house itself. The figure stepped forward, slowly, its movements jerky, as though it was being forced to walk against its will. Sarah couldn't take her eyes off it. Her body screamed for her to run, to flee, but her legs wouldn't move. She was frozen in place, her breath coming in rapid, shallow bursts. The figure came closer, closer still, until she could see the details. Its face was pale, too pale, with dark eyes sunken deep into its skull. It smiled at her, a slow, chilling smile that twisted its features into something monstrous. And then it spoke, its voice echoing through her mind. Sarah? The voice was so familiar. Sounded like Matt. No, it was Matt. Matt? She gasped, her voice cracking. She reached out, her fingers trembling, but the figure stopped moving, its grin growing wider. You shouldn't have come here, Sarah. The figure's voice was a low, gravelly whisper that seemed to crawl under her skin. You belong here now. This place doesn't let go. And neither will we. Her heart pounded as the figure stepped closer. The closer it got, the more its form seemed to distort. The edges of its body blurred, as though it were made of smoke, constantly shifting, never staying the same. You never stood a chance, it continued, the words dripping with malice. We are the house. We are everything that's inside of it. And now you're one of us. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. The voice, it wasn't Matt's. It couldn't be. But it had sounded like him. The figure wasn't Matt. It was something much worse, something older, something that had existed in this place for far longer than she could comprehend. The house, this twisted, decaying structure, was alive. And it was feeding on her fear, her terror. She could feel it now, pulsing beneath the floorboards, in the walls, in every creaking beam. It was alive, and it wasn't letting her go. The figure's grin widened, revealing sharp, jagged teeth, and then it lunged at her, faster than she could react. Its hands wrapped around her throat, icy cold, unyielding, squeezing tighter with every passing second. For a moment, Sarah couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. All she could feel was the crushing pressure, the suffocating darkness, the cold fingers tightening around her neck. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the figure let go, dropping her to the floor with a sickening thud. She gasped for air, her lungs burning as if they were on fire. But it wasn't over. No, not by a long shot. The shadows were still there. The whispers were still there. The house was still there. And it wasn't going to let her leave. Not now. Not ever. Sarah's body lay limp on the cold wooden floor, her breath shallow and erratic, struggling to fill her lungs as her mind spiraled into chaos. She could still feel the cold fingers that had wrapped around her throat, the overwhelming presence of the entity that had tried to claim her. It had been a close call, too close, but the darkness hadn't taken her. Not yet. The house groaned again, its voice rising in a discordant symphony of cracking beams and twisting metal, as if it was alive, feeding on her terror, reveling in her fear. She pushed herself up, her hands shaking as they gripped the floor. Every inch of her skin was chilled to the bone, her heart pounding in her chest like a drum, each beat a loud reminder of her fragile existence in this cursed place. Her eyes darted around the room, trying to focus on anything, but the walls seemed to bend and warp as if the house itself was breathing. The shadows were thicker now, a dark fog that clung to the corners of the room and stretched across the floor like a creeping web. She could feel their weight pressing down on her, smothering her, just waiting for the right moment to close in. The figure, the one that had once resembled Matt, was gone, but its twisted, hollow voice still echoed in her mind. "You belong here now, Sarah. You can't escape. We are one. We are the house." Her throat tightened at the thought. The house. The house wasn't just a structure. It wasn't just a place of evil or darkness. It was a living, breathing entity, an ancient force that fed on fear, that thrived on souls trapped in its walls. And she was its next victim. Her mind raced, spinning through thoughts like a whirlwind. Escape. That was her only hope. She had to get out, no matter what it took. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't become another lost soul, wandering forever in the labyrinth of the house. But as the words escape echoed in her mind, she felt the truth settle deep in her gut. There was no escape. Not now. Not anymore. The ground beneath her shifted again, sending a jolt through her body. She staggered to her feet, her hands bracing herself against the walls for support. But the moment she touched them, the temperature plummeted. Her skin felt like it was being pricked with thousands of needles, sharp and painful. It was as if the house was warning her, reminding her that there was no going back, no way to undo the bond it had formed with her. She looked up at the ceiling, her eyes searching for something, anything, that could offer her some kind of comfort, some sort of escape. But the ceiling seemed to stretch higher and higher, disappearing into darkness, an endless void that swallowed everything in its path. The shadows above were darker now, and the whispers were louder, more frantic. "Sir." Suddenly, a sound broke through the cacophony of whispers. A soft creak, followed by another, and another, like footsteps. She froze, her heart pounding. Someone, or something, was moving within the house. She could hear it. It was getting closer. She turned her head toward the sound, her eyes wide, her pulse quickening. The hallway was empty, but the sound was unmistakable. Something was moving in the shadows. Something that was drawing nearer. Something that was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Her legs gave way beneath her as the weight of the realization hit her. She wasn't alone anymore. The house wasn't the only thing watching her. She had been marked, targeted by the things that inhabited its walls. The figures she had seen, the ones who had whispered to her, those weren't just hallucinations. They were real. They were dead. And now they were coming for her. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they felt like they were inside her head, clawing at her sanity. "You can't hide. You can't run. We'll find you. We'll always find you." The air thickened around her, suffocating, making it harder to breathe. She staggered down the hallway, her feet unsteady, the ground beneath her shifting with each step. The walls seemed to close in on her, narrowing the hallway, forcing her to move faster, her body fighting against the invisible grip that the house had on her. And then she saw it. At the far end of the hallway, the door to the basement stood ajar, its edges bathed in a sickly yellow light that seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat. She had to go down there. She didn't know why, but something inside her told her that the basement was the key, whatever that key meant. It was her only hope. She ran toward it, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her legs weak and trembling beneath her. The door seemed to stretch farther and farther away with each step, the light from the basement flickering, almost teasing her. She reached the door just as the whispers reached a crescendo, the voices now a deafening roar. She swung the door open, throwing herself into the darkness beyond. And the moment she crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind her, plunging her into pitch-black darkness. Her heart raced. Her breath was quick and shallow. She could feel her body trembling, the adrenaline coursing through her veins as she tried to make sense of the space around her. The air down here was heavy, thick, suffocating, and it smelled of mold and decay. But there was something else too, a faint scent, something metallic, almost like blood. The whispers had stopped, but the silence was worse. It was suffocating, pressing in on her, drowning out all thoughts. She couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything except her own breath. Her hand reached for the wall, trying to find a light switch, anything to break the darkness. But her fingers brushed against something cold and wet, something soft like flesh. Her stomach lurched and she pulled her hand back quickly, her pulse thundering in her ears. She took another step back, her eyes straining to make out shapes in the darkness. And then she heard it, a low guttural growl coming from somewhere deep in the room. "You're not alone." The voice was a harsh whisper, as though it had been torn from the very air itself. It was unlike any voice she had heard before. It was ancient, primal, and it sent a chill down her spine. It wasn't the house speaking this time. It was something else, something far worse. And then she felt it, cold fingers, cold hands wrapping around her body, pulling her toward the center of the room. She screamed, her voice swallowed by the darkness, but it was too late. The shadows had claimed her. The house had claimed her. As the coldness consumed her, Sarah's last thought was of escape. The one thing she had been fighting for, the one thing she had been desperately clinging to, freedom, was now out of reach, lost to the darkness forever. The whispers returned, this time louder than ever, as if the house itself was finally satisfied. "You're home now, Sarah. You'll never leave." And with that, the world faded to black.